Welcome back to the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. I'm Matt.
I'm Stefano. I'm the Chief Intelligence Officer on Artorias, and today we are joined again by a regular contributor and guest, John Larrier from Defense Bulletin. John, as always, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's always good to be back on.
Well, in today's episode, everybody, we are going to cover two major news items of significant importance. The first one, obviously front and center that everybody is concerned about, is related on the situation of Iran and the U.S. military strikes and operations centered around the Straits of Hormuz, targeting Iran and the battle there, and basically how the MOU, for all intents and purposes, is on life support. And how both the United States and Iran are very comfortable utilizing military strikes and military operations to try to get a leg up during the possible negotiations that are happening. And all indications are that both sides are going to escalate, and we might see a resumption of war as we saw during February to April. The second area that we want to cover, though, is also related to the situation in Mali. Within the last couple of weeks, we've seen the Al Qaeda affiliate JNM and the Tuareg rebels launch significant amount of offensives across Mali that have really put in a very precarious situation both the Mali junta and the Russian Africa Corps, where they suffered significant amount of casualties and reinforcing the problem sets that are going there. And Matt will provide us the latest there. But quickly, as I said, we are currently recording this episode at around 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on July 12th. I say that so we have a point of reference of the conversations that were going on. And as I said, currently, right now, the United States Central Command are conducting strikes against Iran for the second time today. This follows campaigns of yesterday we saw strikes, and during the weeks, the U.S. conducting extensive strikes. And this all really started, this latest round of violence started when Iran launched multiple drones and hit three or four oil tankers who were trying to cross the southern Straits of Hormuz, the southern route of the Straits of Hormuz, the Omani side, while President Trump was heading and participating in the NATO summit in Turkey. That is what really saw President Trump's frustration during the NATO summit, basically calling the Iranians leaders crazy and saying that he really views the ceasefire as over and that they're willing to have negotiations, but the ceasefire is not in effect. And the United States has conducted significant strikes this week against Iran, and Iran has retaliated with strikes targeting the normal players, Bahrain, Kuwait, even Jordan. But interestingly enough, they've also yesterday conduct strikes against Qatar, UAE, and Oman that generally during the ceasefire, the Iranians have kind of avoided and not tried to target those specific areas, which is kind of significant and interesting. Today, right now, as I said, during 2 days, twice today, there's been strikes by the U.S. Iran did conduct strikes against Kuwait. They claimed that one of the strikes in Kuwait targeted a HIMARS unit. U.S. Central Command flatly denied that and said no U.S. service member were killed or injured, contrary to Iranian claims on the state media. And it's also important to note that while President Trump was in Turkey for the NATO summit, apparently there was a credible plot to assassinate President Trump led by the Iranians, and we got some of those details there. John, I mean, look, we've had a lot of episode covering this, talking about this. For all intents and purposes, the Memorandum of Understanding, also known as the Islamabad MOU, is basically in life support, or you can even make the argument that it exists on name only. The United States has reimposed the sanctions, removed its sanction waivers for Iran to sell oil. Both Iran and the United States continue to conduct military strikes, obviously not to the same degree as we were during the war, but these are the most significant amount of strikes since the ceasefire was announced on April 8th. So, John, would love an overview from your perspective on the military component. And if you can, I mean, do you think we're in a situation where war is going to return, or is there a possibility that diplomacy, still has a chance?
Yeah, I think it's glad that you mentioned the MOU first because it's kind of where I have the first box ticked off in my notes here. And I want to mention the vague nature, the language of the MOU has become a key problem, I think, in the implementation of the MOU itself here. The vague nature of it, specifically uh, things surrounding the administration of the Strait of Hormuz and in the cessation of Israeli hostilities in Lebanon. So I'll begin with Lebanon here, right? The Israelis were supposed to cease hostilities in Lebanon, which they did nominally, right? And then they conduct these strikes that they reserve the right to conduct what they call self-defense strikes against Hezbollah units operating across Lebanon. Majority of them are in the Bekaa Valley and or this south of Lebanon, southern Lebanon here. Um, And so the actual text of the MOU says to quote, declare the immediate and permanent termination of military operations on all fronts, including Lebanon, right? But it doesn't talk about an Israeli withdrawal, though. Since then, the Iranians have now slowly begun to condition an Israeli withdrawal on them implementing their side of the MOU. So that being reopening the Strait of Hormuz, that being not targeting ships and also their Gulf allies and U.S. bases and infrastructure in the region here. And so in point 5 of the MOU, getting into the Strait of Hormuz, it's also vague enough to let them kind of get away with it, right? It talks about, it says, upon signing of this MOU, the Islamic Republic of Iran will make arrangements, including using its best efforts for the safe passage of commercial vessels, right? And their best efforts, is left open to interpretation, essentially, right? Now, obviously, to the layman, right? Well, providing safe passage for vessels means that it's free and open passage. Well, the Iranians also interpreted this, and I think I'll get to this later in a bit. I think JD Vance may have undermined the implementation of this by talking about the gentleman's agreements on the side, right? Because the Iranians have seemed to interpret this as, well, we get to administer the Strait of Hormuz and charge fees and designate which outbound and inbound transit lanes are used. According to the United States, that is not the case. According to Oman, that is not the case. According to the International Maritime Organization and other Gulf nations in the region, that is not the case. But Iran has said otherwise, and they're acting on otherwise as well here. And so from the very beginning, the language of the MOU made this very untenable here. And so that's kind of where we've ended up where we are now. From a military standpoint, this is almost kind of like a kinetic form of mission creep here, right? We've seen the U.S. response. We've kind of gone through this cycle here where Iran, and we mentioned this the last time we spoke on Iran, where Iran will perceive or a real provocation, whether it's from Israel or the United States or just a vessel traveling through the strait, not in their Persian Gulf Strait Authority designated lanes. They'll perceive that as a provocation. They'll strike a ship, 2 ships, or 3 ships. The U.S. will respond, and the U.S. responses have been getting quicker and quicker and quicker, and they've also been growing in scale here and size. They're largely sequestered to southern and southwestern, southern and southwestern Iran here, but there is a possibility that these may expand. I think the nature of the targets has also been expanding too. We've been seeing army barracks increasingly getting hit. We've been seeing Basij headquarters, which is the Basij is the security forces. They're most recently well known for putting down the protests directly before the war. Basij headquarters have begun to get hit as well, and we've also reportedly seen a number of nuclear plants, or at least the perimeters of them, getting targeted by U.S. strikes here. So the scale and the nature of targets is definitely expanding here. And so there is this possibility that we could just kind of sleepwalk ourselves into another full-scale kind of reciprocal strike situation.
Actually, John, if I may jump in, because you were talking about this while we're doing this recording, right now the strikes that the United States are doing is centered around Avas province. Specifically, it's actually, this was interesting because we was doing a space about this. And one of the units that was targeted, and apparently the headquarters that was targeted, is the 92nd Armored Division in Khuzestan province, which is Avas, right? And that's southwest Iran. It also has the 192nd Armored Brigade base in Dezful, Khuzestan. And what's significant about this is that the 92nd Armored Division, again, they are the regular Arakash, and it's truly the only unit within the Iranian military that you can consider a proper armored division because of its task organization and its equipment. Like, it does have the equipment to be considered an armored division. That appears to be one of the center of strikes right now. Clearly, you can maybe make the argument that they're doing the strikes there because Khuzestan is a key component where Iran can launch strikes against Kuwait. But to expand on your point, the Aritesh has been largely ignored, not completely, but largely ignored or deprioritized in strikes. But today it does appear it might be one of the central focus of U.S. strike campaigns.
Yeah, and I think that's something. I think it's good you noted that as well, because then that may indicate that the U.S. is willing to conduct other forms of military operations. I don't want to get into ground operations just yet because I think that's kind of throwing the bait out there too far. But what I do think it is possible is that we're expanding the degradation of their military to expand outside of the IRGC infrastructure framework and personnel only here. I think there's a good enough understanding that the Artesh potentiates IRGC hold on certain things, especially with the IRGC's current hold on power here, and they're deepening hold on power since Mojtaba Khamenei came into power here and has begun to delegate so much power to the generals. Now, exactly why we're beginning to strike more regular army units, that remains to be seen to me. But it could be setting the stage for increased U.S. military action, whether that's a ground operations or just or just an effort to mitigate, like you mentioned, the strikes on Kuwait, which Kuwait has noticeably been getting what could be called the brunt of some of these strikes since the ceasefire kind of broke down. We saw the UAE. I think if we all remember here, during the 40-day war, the initial war, the UAE bore the brunt in upwards of thousands, I mean hundreds more drone and missile strikes in other Gulf nations, and now it seems Kuwait is now bearing the brunt. There were reports that the UAE made payments to Iran or had promised payments, and that may be why that may have mitigated that threat from Iran. But that, they obviously denied those as well. Saudi Arabia is another country that has yet to get hit since the ceasefire as well, but Kuwait has kind of borne the brunt here, and so this may be an understanding that the U.S. is going to hit this area hard, these areas inside of Khuzestan province, specifically to kind of placate the Kuwaitis who have been getting hit rather hard in the past couple of days and weeks.
Actually, John, let me ask you a question because during this week, when we've seen this increased amount of strikes, there was one specific day where there were strikes in Iran that the US said we had no involvement. And so the speculation was this a GCC country that did it? We really not got any reporting on who was involved in the strikes and if and who might have did. What do you think, John? Do you think this was one of the Gulf countries? Could have been Kuwait, could have been Bahrain, could have been the UAE or Saudi Arabia, or do you think there was something else to this story? Because that was a very weird development. And after those strikes, it's important to note Iran did not retaliate when they were struck, and they said that there were strikes. We said some Iranian government officials maybe try to walk it back, but it was clear as day there was a strike campaign that just did not come from the U.S.
Yeah, that is interesting, and I remember that too. And the only thing, and I was kind of asking around other analysts and subject matter experts, they were kind of bewildered as well. And it seems the only consensus that we can come up with is that it wasn't Israel, right? Because that was at first people were talking, well, maybe Israel may be involved here, and then Israel came out and said they weren't. And if there was any small, even the smallest minute indication that Israel had been part of that, I think Iran would have responded and struck Israel by now. They don't really need much of an excuse. But it's possible it could be Kuwait and or the UAE. I don't see any other Gulf nation conducting strikes directly against them. I know in the past the UAE did join strikes in a self-defense manner. That is, they did join strikes against Iran in a limited fashion, albeit, right? If this was Kuwait, this would be the first, as I understand it, in the war so far here. And I think they're the two only possible actors who would conduct retaliatory strikes here because, well, first off, UAE has been getting hit hard in the past by them, but since then, Kuwait has been getting hit rather hard. And so they would have the best justification right now to conduct retaliatory strikes against Iran. Now, whether or not there's some sort of understanding made with the Iranians that in a post-strike framework or after these strikes say, hey, we just hit you, don't do, obviously Iran's going to continue to strike U.S. base and infrastructure in Kuwait. We did see, though, these kind of commensurate releases from Iranian decision makers kind of justifying how during the war they began to overly justify their strikes on their Gulf neighbors. We're only striking U.S. base and infrastructure. That's the only reason Iranian missiles are flying towards these countries. We saw a lot of that after these reported strikes here, and that could be them trying to justify to the Gulf nations on why they're striking them. But I think as of right now, Kuwait has the best justification for it, and the only other actor in the region that I see conducting strikes on them right now would be the UAE.
Right, because during the war that happened, what we saw was, UAE did participate much more than originally when the war was happening suspected. Other countries that were involved in strikes against Iran was Saudi Arabia also participated. That looks like there was more coordination with the Iranians when the Saudis conducted strikes. But what was interesting is where Saudi Arabia and Kuwait were involved heavily was conducting strikes against pro-Iranian militia groups in Iraq. Right, that's kind of an aspect. So some of the conversations, suspicion was maybe Bahrain also conducted strikes against Iran, that they might have been that player that did. But I think the consensus really was either Kuwait or Bahrain that did those strikes. John, before we go to Iraq, because I think that's another important aspect within this overarching conversation, I do want to focus a little bit more on the Iran piece. I mean, right now, clearly all sides are using military might to do this. The question that I have, though, is the Iranian calculus, right? Because I think there's various ways we can analyze it. And one of the things I was a guest on a recent live stream where I talked about this actually yesterday is the question that I have is, we got some reporting, and this is coming from Arab mediators, right? And they might be leveraging to give an excuse for Iran, right, for their behavior. But one of the arguments that the Iranian mediators are saying and diplomats are saying is that the people who are doing these strikes by Iran are elements within the IRGC who do not want the MOU implementation, and that they use military might to conduct these strikes to undermine Iran's negotiations with the US and try to take the hardline approach that they want to impose. So they impose it by military means. And it was interesting because there was a New York Times article report that that's something that, I've talked about regularly in all the other interviews and spaces, and I think we've even discussed here, which is the internal dynamics of Iran is people generally viewed Iran within two large camps, the hardliners and the pragmatics, and the reformists. And ever since Ali Khamenei was assassinated, the problem is there's not really a dominant leader in Iran who can dictate the terms. And Muhammad Khamenei hasn't really well established himself. And you see camps forming in Iran trying to vie for control. And what the New York Times article articulated was it's not only just the pragmatic and the hardliners, but even within those camps, there's different rival factions all competing against each other. So it's not two, there's maybe more than just that, dozens of camps all vying for influence. And it looks like, at least from the governance perspective and the negotiation perspectives, that some elements of the pragmatists have the upper hand, but the hardliners and the IRGC control the guns and control the internal process of Iran. So my question for you, though, is do you think Iran is conducting these strikes or because they're frustrated with the MOU, and this has been broadly agreed upon as by the Iranian nation, or could there be a possibility, as these Arab negotiators said, that maybe there's elements within the IRGC who want to undermine the negotiations, and they understand by conducting these strikes, they can, undermine Arachi and Ghalibaf from negotiating with JD Vance and the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there are elements within the IRGC, but I think it goes higher than that. I mean, I do believe it was New York Times or WSJ who also reported kind of to the same effect, along the same vein of thought, that is, that Khomeini had kind of felt when he acceded to allowing the MOU to be signed, he kind of felt like this had been imposed on him. And kind of his wording on how he kind of, I can't remember his exact wording that they used, the quote from the Iranian source, but the quote that the wording he used was kind of even seen as vague, was kind of seen as like he felt like this MOU was being imposed on him. So I
Actually,
don't
so
even.
let me expand on that. So from the New York Times report was that Muqtada Khamenei, the Iranian president, threatened to resign if Muqtada Khamenei did not agree to the MOU, because from the president perspective is the Iranian economy is in financial ruin, is going to collapse. And if they don't do something quickly, there is no hope for the Iranian economy. What Muqtada Khamenei then said was, I will agree to the signing of the MOU as long as the Supreme National Security Council agrees to it. And that looks like was what happened. And then maybe, and clearly Muqtada Khamenei, though the problem I think we're running into is that and this has been widely identified, he's not his father. Like his father was the ultimate decision maker, right? He was the supreme leader in practice and in reality. Muqtada Khamenei is the supreme leader in name only. And I think that's the problem.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off that, there's a great Modern Warfare Institute write-up that happened right after Khomeini, his father, was killed, and it was talking about just that, how he was able to exercise power over the pragmatics, over the more hardline RGC elements, and kind of dictate who gets power when and who gets power over what, and ultimately kind of balance that really really tenuous power balance within the country. His son, however, who was not necessarily seen by him as someone who might be able to even take power without significantly more grooming, and is also seen by some analysts as more hard line, does not have that power, as you mentioned here. In the MWI report, they talk about how it's highly unlikely that he's going to be able to exercise the same level of control over both factions, but more importantly over the IRGC factions, as his father had over both factions. And more importantly, I think what lends credence to that report is that the amount of agency he's given IRGC generals and decision makers within not only with decisions within the country, but their foreign policy as well here. And I think that's the biggest thing, that the level of agency and the level of power that they've gained by him delegating so much power to the generals has allowed them to directly undermine the MOU process, and to also undermine the work and the foreign policy and strategic outlook efforts of more moderate, of more pragmatic decision makers like Ghalibaf and like Abbas Araghchi.
It's interesting because while we're doing this recording again on 12 July around 7:30 Eastern Standard Time, within the last couple, 10 to 20 minutes, New York Times reports that a U.S. official says to expect, quote, a bigger wave of American strikes against Iranian military targets tonight than those carried out earlier in the day. So it looks like these waves of attack are going to be bigger than before. It's important to note that during this week strike campaign, one of the U.S. officials said, like, look, this isn't retaliation, this is a punishment. Because before this wave, it was a tit for tat. Iran would conduct an attack, we would conduct a retaliation. You could even make an argument it was proportional, and some of the strikes might have been symbolic, some of them was a retaliation. Clearly now this week has been a punishment, and as the week has progressed, the United States has conducted more and more and more strikes at greater magnitude and intensity as the week has carried on. So that I think is a very interesting development that kind of maybe walks into next week and what we're looking for. Right now, there's no real opportunity, at least publicly, of a diplomatic off-ramp. We'll see if one is agreed upon to see if this goes on. Oil that saw a historical drop in the prices is now slowly ticking up again. It's also important to note that U.S. officials claimed to Axios that in the last 24 hours, over 20 commercial vessels passed through the Straits of Hormuz in direct coordination with the U.S. military, and others were able to also cross through the southern Straits of Hormuz without coordinating with the U.S. military, obviously at a much lower level than we saw historically in the past. But with that update, John, the question I want to do to follow on in this previous conversation that you were having in your analysis is, I think one of the questions that I have is are we running into a situation where inside of Iran there's a fight to see how Iran looks like for the future? In other words, you could see some elements within Iran, specifically led by the president, by Araghchi and Ghalibaf, who might want to focus more on the economy. We see the hardliners trying to impose others. It's important to note that inside of Iran, execution against dissidents and protesters as an all-time high. Property is being seized left and right. Oppression is at its levels not seen in years inside of Iran. Is there a fight within Iran that is being almost exported through the military campaign against the United States in the Straits of Hormuz? And the key question we need to look into is, how does Iran look like a year to 10 years from now? Because one of the previous episodes, we were talking about this window of opportunity of a more nationalistic Iran, and maybe that's what the U.S. Is trying to strive for. But clearly, there's elements within Iran who are not happy with that and might leverage this war with the U.S. to maybe impose their vision of Iran.
Yeah, I think what doesn't need to be said is that it depends on who comes out the hardliners, the more pragmatics here. But I think you're right. I think that there's a focus from the pragmatic decision makers to kind of rebuild Iran, focus on their economy, consolidate within, whereas the hardliners are looking to consolidate as they go out. Consolidate from a foreign policy standpoint here, right? We see a lot of focus from hardliners on consolidating specifically in the Strait of Hormuz, and then also reconsolidating in their, what their so-called axis of resistance that they've taken some pretty big hits. Iraq, we'll get into that later as well. And we see some reconsolidation efforts there. We've seen recent visits from Iranian decision makers to Iraq as well, and they've more than likely met with militia leaders as well here. So I think, if you're going to ask me what Iran looks like in 10 years from now, I think we'd have to get outside of this kind of reciprocal tit for tat strike phase first here. Whether we'll get out of that in the near future remains to be seen here. One thing I do want to mention, just talking about the military strikes here, I think one big indication for kind of this renewed upscaled and high tempo conflict, one of the biggest flashpoints we need to look for is when the strikes begin to target government facilities and government buildings again, and whether we begin to see decapitation strikes again as well. If we begin to see those at a higher pace and a more increased rate, I think that's going to be a bigger indication that the U.S. is willing to kind of play this long game here when it comes to strikes. But as it relates to Iran 10 years from now, though, I think you could give out two options here. If the pragmatics win here, we're going to see heavy consolidation, a heavy prioritization, heavy consolidation within a lot of prioritization of outside investments. So whether it's Russia, whether it's China, whether it's other nations that are more friendly with Iran and willing to invest in Iran. We're going to be seeing a lot of efforts like that here. If the hardliners went out, we're going to see that as well, right? I think it's important to know that they will welcome foreign investment from friendly countries as much as the pragmatic decision makers will, but they're also going to prioritize consolidating in the local region as well, in the wider Middle East as well. They're also going to likely prioritize some level of retaliation, whether that's clandestine efforts or more overt efforts here. They've taken a great loss here, and I'm not saying from a strategic standpoint they have physically lost so much, whether it's everything from tech all the way to just physical infrastructure. They've lost so much. They're going to be looking for a get back here, in more of a sense than more pragmatic decisions will be looking for, and they may not care about the consequences. Well, I think it's fair to say they will not care about the consequences as much as the more pragmatic decision makers here. So I think we're going to be either way. I think we're going to be seeing a more combative Iran to the U.S. strategic outlook in the region, and the wider Western strategic outlook in the region, and what that bodes for their relationships with their Gulf neighbors. That also remains to be seen as well, because just prior to this war, we're seeing a Chinese brokered semi-rapprochement between them and Saudi Arabia. That's likely in the dust as well now. I mean, obviously, so are other efforts, the U.S. brokered efforts with Saudis and Israel as well. But so how that relates to their relationship, they fired off hundreds of thousands of missiles and drones at their Gulf neighbors. We're going to go back to this kind of where the Strait of Hormuz is essentially a trench line in a not a long forgotten war, but in a war now here, and the diplomatic row between them is going to last decades, if not more than a century here, before Iran is able to kind of recoup the good faith between them and their Gulf neighbors.
And obviously, there wasn't a ton of good faith prior to this
Exactly.
conflict. So I guess my question is, and this is kind of building off of what Stefano was talking about in terms of some of the rhetoric and the language around expecting larger strikes tonight, and some of the issues that you've talked about with the Iranian regime. To me, it looks like there is a serious uh, danger of this getting sort of out of hand again. And the escalation ladder is something that like obviously needs to be taken into account whenever we see major powers and this type of conflict. But with Iran specifically, sort of in this new position that they haven't fully defined yet, where they want to exert control over the strait, but at the same time, we're seeing, sort of their proxy network is a lot weaker than it has been in the past. And now we're seeing like the Gulf states more willing to cooperate with the United States and probably with each other to take action against, not just these proxies, but you guys were positing potentially directly against Iran as well. So like what is your concern that like this isn't just the end of a ceasefire, but might actually like fully reignite this conflict?
Yeah, I think there's a high likelihood it reignites the conflict. I think we're right there on the threshold. Like I said before, when talking about looking for specific flashpoints and the different target sets that we're seeing here, I'd continue to warn to look for those as well here. But I think we're right here on the threshold of going back to that high tempo and ups that high tempo conflict that characterized the 40-day war here. Um, uh, we've yet to see it expand. We saw it expand for a few days, a few weeks ago between Iran and Israel here, but they were able to put a dampening on that here pretty fairly quickly with considerable U.S. and Gulf nation pressure on both Iran and Iran and Israel. But we're already seeing them begin to expand their strikes to essentially all of their Gulf neighbors here. Saudi Arabia is now the only nation, as I understand it, and Oman has now been included in this too, which is something I was keep wondering to hear you guys take on. Saudi Arabia is now the only Gulf nation who has not been struck against since the MOU has been signed, or at least since the ceasefire has been signed. And as of right now, I'm questioning how long that's going to last here. I think Saudi Arabia has been willing to play the diplomatic role, but has been pretty staunch in its declarations that they're not looking for this thing to get out of hand again. Obviously, I wrote a short assessment on X, I think, a few days ago, and I was talking about how we saw this flurry of Saudi Arabian diplomatic calls and diplomatic meetings between Saudi Arabian decision makers and U.S. decision makers in the days leading up to this kind of resumption of higher tempo conflict between Iran and the United States. And that's 100% because Saudi Arabia does not like to want to see this thing out of hand again. Because if you look at how many barrels of oil were transiting the Strait in the time between when the MOU was signed, the ceasefire was signed, and now it was in the increased by the millions, albeit it was still below the pre-war levels, but they were able to push a lot of oil through, stockpiled oil, and then also oil that had been just sitting and waiting to get through here. And they were able to push a lot of it through. So from an economic standpoint, they benefited greatly, and they're looking to compound on those economic benefits here. And so they don't necessarily want to see that happen here. But so far, other Gulf nations have all gotten struck, and the United States has openly said and has openly acted on their promises that they're 100% willing to retaliate immediately, and they have, every time Iran continues to threaten commercial shipping in the Strait here. And that goes back to Iran's calculus of, well, what are we going to get out of this MOU? Which what they think, and their interpretation of the MOU is that they are going to administrate the Strait of Hormuz. And so when other actors, whether that's state actors or companies, decide to push a vessel through, they see that as direct violation. Now, the interesting thing for Iran here is this kind of gets into what I think, Stefano, you were talking about, which is the calculus of the ongoing dynamic within Iran. Is Iran knows the U.S. is going to retaliate immediately when they strike these vessels here. And this is what confused me about the yesterday's meeting in Oman, which was really centered around the administration or lack thereof of the Strait of Hormuz here. You know, I posited that nothing was going to get done, and nothing did get done. But then Iran began to strike Oman as well in their quote unquote retaliatory strikes after the U.S. struck them. They struck Oman. They also struck a vessel off the coast of Oman as well here. Uh, it's interesting to see as Oman has been the only one who's kind of what you could call steadfastly in their corner throughout this whole thing. It's interesting to see them, strike Oman. And I was wondering to hear your guys' takes. Do you think that could hurt their relationship significantly with Oman, or do you think Oman is just willing to weather it? Uh,
No, I mean, that's an important point because Oman did today, the morning of Sunday, the Omani Ministry of Foreign Affairs did summon the Iranian ambassador to Oman to launch a protest. And clearly, Oman is in this very tight situation where we got some reporting that Oman was trying to find this way that maybe Iran voluntary tolls, similar to the situation in Singapore, where it was not imposed, but it was voluntary. And clearly, Oman was much more willing to find a diplomatic solution that was more favorable to Iran without necessarily, breaking international law, but trying to say, okay, how can we do this? And the fact that, the IRGC then strikes Oman, it kind of is a very hard situation. But we've already been in this situation before, right? And Oman kind of plays that role. So I mean, I think the United States is also exerting an enormous amount of pressure on Oman, and I would even say the European Union as well. So I think the Omani dynamic is more complex, where I think there's some elements within the Omani government that might be more pro-Iranian, while others are much more traditionally within the pro-GCC, Saudi, and Western camp. And you might see that kind of dynamic play out on the negotiation table. But clearly, Oman has been very public that the free flow of goods without tolls is a priority for the Straits of Hormuz. I also think is what's very important is that if Kuwait was the one that conducted the strikes against Iran, and again, it's important to note that Kuwait did conduct strikes against pro-Iranian groups in Iraq during the war. But if it was Kuwait who did those strikes, that would be a very significant development diplomatically and regionally, because Kuwait has generally, from a foreign policy perspective, been less hawkish on Iran. And during the war, Kuwait was one of those that was advocating a de-escalation, right? And trying to convince the Trump administration to take a different approach. But clearly, we see the United States still use Kuwait, specifically their HIMARS, to conduct strikes against Iran. Was tonight, a lot of the strikes are going on are centered around that border region of Khuzestan and Avaz that borders Iraq and southwest Iran, which I think is very interesting. But, John, my kind of follow-on question to you is, look, the MOU exists in papers only, right? The U.S. Removed the waivers for Iran to say sell oil, right? They removed that, so that's not in place anymore. Military strikes are going on back and forth. Iran has, and the IRGC announced that the Straits of Hormuz is closed, even though CENTCOM says it's not, but at least in the diplomatic and publicly they say it's closed. Really, the only thing left is we have the situation related to the U.S. reimposing a naval blockade. And then we have Israel joining the war again, right? That's the only two things left. The U.S. already conducted strikes against two rail infrastructure this week. Bridges, clearly is a message from President Trump threatening to conduct strikes against bridges, rail infrastructure, and even energy infrastructure if he feels the negotiations going through. I think the message was sent with those strikes, right? So, Israel, Israel can um, obviously has the reporting that we got from Israel is that they assess that Iran does not want to draw Israel into the war, and that the only way that Israel is going to get involved is in two cases. One, if Iran conducts a strike against Israel, which they haven't during this whole ceasefire violation. The only time they did do a strike was when Israel conducted a strike in Beirut and they retaliated very severely. So that's number one. If Iran conducts a strike against Israel, which doesn't look like they're going to do, and number two is if the United States requests Israel to join. Do you see a scenario where the United States might say, Israel, it's time to get involved? And at that point, is the MOU dead?
Yeah, I'll say this quickly, and then I think Matt has something he wants to, some input he wants to give. For one, I agree 100% that the MOU is completely dead and it exists in name only and on paper here. But I don't see the U.S. asking Israel to join. I think the Trump administration has an understanding that Israel joining escalates significantly, and the Iranian reaction is going to be much more visceral in nature, and it has been in the past when Israel joins here. And it'll be much harder to rein in a kind of let off the leash Israel than it will just to be to announce that, hey, our unilateral strikes are over, or we're going to increase the tempo or decrease the tempo in them. I think because Israel will give a lot more pushback here. And I just don't think the U.S. is ready to kind of go down that rabbit hole again willingly. I think as of right now, from an assets perspective, we maintain enough assets and munitions in theater right now to conduct the operation that we want to. Now, the caveat there is if we're going to significantly increase the tempo of these strikes, well, then that changes the dynamic a little bit, and we may request Israel to kind of compound and to team them with our capabilities as we have in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. I think one of the things that we also can't lose sight of here is domestic politics in Israel. Like if we are looking at election there, it might behoove Bibi to take some sort of action. So it might not even be up to like the United States or Iran. If he decides that he is going to take action, he's just going to do it. I think that's become pretty clear. Uh, and then just to backtrack a little bit, I wanted to go back to, your question about the KSA and your point about Oman. I think what Stefano was saying about Oman, like one of the points he brought up was the tolls. That friction, I think, is key to why you saw those strikes because they do want it to remain open. It doesn't seem like they're on board with any sort of fee structure that the Iranians have in mind. So that's definitely something that we should keep watching. And then the other thing with the KSA, uh, they have, bilateral communication straight to Tehran. And that's sort of like an interesting situation. But you also have to keep in mind, like they also have bypassed the official Yemen government to speak to the Houthis. And so Saudi Arabia is probably conducting those back channels to make sure that they don't see the ramifications of this escalation. How long that lasts, I couldn't tell you, but it's got to be a very tricky position for them because we saw they had a lot of trouble handling the Houthis.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Your first point as well too, because in the early days of the ceasefire, I think we all remember we saw Iranian media, state-backed news outlets reporting that Oman and Iran are talking about joint, administration of the Strait, and then Oman would come out and be like, "Well, no, we're not really talking about that," or they would say, "We've had these talks, but we're not willing to impose fees," and then Iran would come back and say, "Well, yeah, they are. We've talked about this," and it was kind of this interesting thing, kind of when you're both lying, you and your friend have done something as kids, and one's lying to your mom, the other one's just trying to be honest about it. That's the kind of dynamic I see there, and I definitely see the frustration Iran has with that.
I'm just kind of going through kind of from the strikes. Again, these these round of strikes clearly geographically are much more expansive, right? When we were seeing previous rounds of ceasefire violations and kind of these retaliatory strikes, generally the United States concentrated its strikes in the immediate area around, the Straits of Hormuz, Nasir, Keshem Island, Bandar Abbas, right? Maybe Chabahar, but generally they were concentrated more around the Keshem Island area, right, in Bandar Abbas, and that's southern province of Iran. But this week, I think there's been a change where, although there still are strikes, there was much more expansive, and even the target package is much more expensive. And right now, interestingly enough, Abbas and Khuzestan is there. We've seen strikes in Kagan, Kermanshah, even up near Tehran and those real bridges. So, John, I guess my last question for you before we transition over to Mali. I mean, looking at the week ahead, how do you think the United States is going to approach this militarily? Are we going to see maybe a refocus on just targets that can threaten the Straits of Hormuz? Could we see a geographical expansion of the strikes? Or is there a possibility that, the US says, not only as President Trump already declared that the ceasefire is dead, even though they'll allow technical talks and continue negotiations to continue, but the ceasefire is effectively dead. Do you think he just declares the whole thing over and we're back at the time frame of February, March, and April, where the U.S. and Israel conducts expansive strikes against Iran? What do you think is the next week looking like militarily?
Yeah, I think militarily the next week we're going to, if the Iranians are unwilling to accede to some level of, to give the concession that of free and open passage of maritime traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, we're going to be continue to see increase in the tempo of U.S. strikes. We're going to continue to see an expansion of the types of targets they strike as well. We could even possibly see some level of decapitation strikes with lower level administrators and lower level military and or possibly and or civilian decision makers as well here. But I think that's unlikely in a week period, the striking of civilian decision makers. But like you already said before, we've already kind of seen some low level military decision makers possibly get targeting decapitation strikes. We could see that in the next week as well. But the U.S., like you have said, has shown it's willing to significantly expand the scale of the strikes and the tempo of the strikes as Iran continues to violate and or not be compliant with the terms of the MOU here, whether in response to perceived provocations. And so that's something that's highly likely that we're going to see is continued expansion of the U.S. strike campaign here. I don't see Israel getting directly involved in the next week, barring a significant development. And obviously, sometimes I think, like Matt rightly mentioned, Bibi can do things unilaterally, and we could see that as well. But I think Trump might, if it's really the Trump administration's wish that the Bibi not get involved, if Israeli unilateral strikes do happen, they'll get tamped down on pretty hard. There'll be significant U.S. pressure for them to cease that. Something will be held over their head, limiting of arms shipments or something like that, or certain funding to certain programs as well. But I think that the one thing that I can promise will happen if Iran is not willing to accede to some level of freedom of passage through the Strait of Hormuz is a continued increase in U.S. strikes here. I think, as evidenced by tonight and the significant expansion of just tonight's strikes, and the amount of cities and targets that they've been able to hit. I think in the first response after the ceasefire kind of sort of broke down a few weeks ago, in a 2-day period they hit 80 targets. In the last, I believe, strike wave, U.S. strike wave, they had 140 targets in one strike wave, and so that's significantly increasing. It's likely going to be double and or triple from tonight's strike. So.
I mean, I think that's the key aspect. And it's interesting what you said about the Straits of Hormuz. Yesterday, a U.S. official told ABC News that if Iran didn't announce that the Straits of Hormuz was opened on Saturday, did not publicly announce that it was open on Saturday, that they would suffer significant consequences. And I think now we're at that point. So clearly, the Straits of Hormuz is the major sticking point. I think, as you alluded to in the beginning, John, I really like that with the JD Vance. I think the way the MOU was written, the way it was framed, gave Iran more leverage than the U.S. was comfortable with. Clearly, hardline elements within the IRGC took that to take it to extreme measures. We saw members of the Iranian parliament and government institutions demand that the status quo of the Straits of Hormuz is permanently changed into their management and control, something that not only the United States but the international community will not accept. And that's why we have this new area of violence that's going on. So with that, I think it's important to note that I think it's important to now transition to the area of Mali. Matt, this is obviously an area that you really focus on. earlier in the week, there was a lot of reporting about Anafis, that area in Mali between the junta and the Africa Corps, where it looked like the units were surrounded, that JNM was very successful and the rebels, and then they now we got then the junta and Africa Corps managed to break the blockade or break the siege, liberate the units there when they were in a very precarious situation. Today there was a report in central Mali that maybe a convoy was ambushed where the junta suffered significant amount of casualties, something that has happened already in Mali. Obviously, you can look at the Sahel as a whole. Burkina Faso continues to have problems. Boko Haram in Nigeria and Cameroon continues to have issues. Recently, Cameroon announced killing a couple of Boko Haram fighters in northern Cameroon who went through the Lake Chad area. So clearly, the Sahel has a significant problem with Islamists, as we have covered extensively. But within the last couple of weeks, when we look at Mali, we saw another what appeared to be a very successful offensive, but that still the junta and the Africa Corps managed to at least stop it from being a catastrophe and a significant catastrophic loss for those guys. So, for the listeners who don't track Mali as extensive as you, can you give us a summary of the major news items that you've seen in the last couple of weeks? And does this show that the capabilities of JNAM, the Tuareg rebels, are increasing, staying the same, or maybe the ability of the junta and Africa Corps are improving and maybe they're caught by surprise at the beginning, but they can rapidly adapt and respond?
Yeah, so it's a pretty complex situation. I think some of this is a little bit surprising. So when we first saw the coordination between the Tuareg group, the FLA, and JNIM, which is Islamic extremist organization affiliated with Al Qaeda, um, it seemed like a sort of like this, not a partnership, but there was coordination because it worked for both sides. This is developing into sort of a convenient partnership, and it's proved more resilient than I think a lot of people were expecting. And what we've seen recently with Anefes is the the change in strategy and the demonstration of capabilities that we hadn't seen so much from Janum before. So we were used to tracking uh, ambushes or raids, and those were happening on a day-to-day basis. But what we're seeing now is a lot more coordinated. A lot of what we're looking at when we talk about an FS is the FLA, but it's assumed that Janum was involved in some of those actions. And they're moving to this capability to really pester these reinforcement efforts. The first convoy that was sent was devastated. The Africa Corps, the Russian troops there, lost a Mi-24. And these these organizations are, moving towards deploying FPV drones. So I don't think that was a tech transfer necessarily, but the knowledge transfer from JNIM to FLA should have the junta and the Africa Corps very nervous because this should be something that you would think the Russians would be very aware of because of what they've seen in Ukraine. So the situation is concerning for the junta. I think because this relationship is um, getting stronger between JNIM and the Tuaregs, there should definitely be some concern in Bamako. And even though on paper the goals and the motivations don't precisely align, I think what we are seeing is movement towards, originally I think JNIM was trying to disrupt the government in Bamako, the junta, and the FLA really wants to assert control over the north. But I think with the weakness that has been showed by Bamako and the Malian army and their partners, that goal is shifting to potentially, or at least it's on the table, complete collapse of the junta, which would not be good for the United States or any of the other countries in the region. And, you know, Burkina Faso and Niger, also ruled by junta, but more importantly to the United States, are partners in places like Benin or Nigeria. So none of these updates are good for the region, I would say.
So, what do you make of, these kind of this campaign from JNM and the Tuareg rebels? Is this a situation where, it's maybe a death by a thousand cuts? Is this a situation where JNM wants to have a significant, effect? But, I remember one of the episodes we were talking about is that JNM's priority right now is not necessarily governance. It's not like comparable to the Taliban in Afghanistan, where they would have parallel governance or they have either a significant influence or direct territorial control over certain population areas in Afghanistan. JNM has taken a different approach. Are you still seeing that that is the same approach? And what is JNM's overall objective in this? The death by a thousand cuts, maybe a 1-2 knockout punch. What do you think it is?
I mean, I think they're getting more ambitious. I think the original sort of posture was exactly like you said, which is the death by a thousand cuts, where they continue these daily raids, they continue to undermine the sort of monopoly of violence. I know that's overused, but destabilize pretty much everywhere outside of Bamako, especially in the north and in the east. But what we're seeing now is more complex. It takes more coordination. They are trying to isolate these garrisons. They're trying to force the government to send like resupplies and send convoys that they can then ambush. And we saw a lot of success when they did ambush those convoys. And so, to me, being able to conduct a siege and being able to coordinate attacks across like multiple axes is something that we weren't seeing at the beginning of this year or last year or previously, really. And there's a lot of focus on the weapons that they're probably attaining if they are able to capture a garrison. And so there's just this continuous flow of the financing that they now get to sort of share the benefits of, because the Tuareg forces have their own sources of financing. And they're able to develop this FPV drone program probably somewhat independently of JNIM, but JNIM has experience and has been known to use those FPV drones as well and can share what they have learned through their implementation of those. So it should be very concerning for Bamako, and you have to keep in mind the footprint of JNIM expands past Mali.
So I have two questions, and I'll ask them by part. My first question is, look, the junta came into power in Mali because of the failures of the government in Mali and the French-led coalition to stop the tide of JNM and ISIS in the Greater Sahel. Is there now a concern that there might be another coup inside of Iran because of all these failures? Or is the presence of the Russian military, in a way, a mitigating factor to prevent a coup, similar to what we see, Russia's presence in the Central African Republic?
So I would say the justification for the junta was the failure and the security issue. Things have gotten so much worse. I think the world realized pretty quickly when the French pulled out that there are not many countries capable of providing even the level of security, even though there were obviously problems, there aren't many countries that are capable of providing the level of security that the French were. And we saw the UN mission collapse soon thereafter for that very reason. So the writing was kind of on the wall. The junta was never actually going to be able to secure the country in a meaningful way. And that wasn't necessarily their goal, and it certainly wasn't Wagner's goal at the time. It was to protect the interests of those involved in the junta, and those involved in the junta were well placed to conduct it. So I think the if we were to see a follow-up, because there is certainly a lot more destabilization since we've seen these actions taking place in the north. Uh, it's not unrealistic to think that that would be even more of a driving force if we were to see the regime fall. And it is something that we've seen time and time again. A lot of these happened, back to back to back in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. So it would not be out of the question to see another coup take place. I think it's a little bit more difficult because of the presence of the Africa Corps now.
I'll ask my second question. I know John has a question for you. The second question is exactly perfectly how you ended this. My second question is, based on everything you've seen in the last couple of weeks within the alliance of the Sahel states, which one is the weakest link? Is it Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, with everything going on? Where do you see as the weakest link? And then John can ask this question.
Oh, I think right now it's Mali. And that's because they're bearing the brunt of this. But we've seen that neither Burkina Faso or Niger are in great positions. And the spillover into a lot of those Gulf states is pretty significant. But we are not seeing anything on the scale that we are seeing in Mali. And I think the fact that the FLA and JNIM have come together in this is a big part of why Mali is so at risk right now. And the only benefit there is that it does not border those Gulf states.
Yeah, yeah, thanks. I have one question I did have is from my own research, and I'm not, this isn't generally my wheelhouse, the Sahel, but it is understood that the FLA and JNIM, their cooperation is not necessarily unprecedented, but it is something to be noted. How long do you see cooperation between them being tenable? Are there known points of contention between the two, or is this something that it's we're going to see for the foreseeable future?
So that's difficult to answer because like I did not expect this relationship to be as resilient as it has been. You point out like it's not unprecedented. It makes sense. It's happened before, but this is sort of like a different level of coordination beyond like sort of like the tactical level. Um, Overall, their goals don't necessarily align. Um, but we've seen intentionally from both sides an attempt not to openly criticize the other, even though they don't necessarily align in terms of their motivations. I think that if JNIM can allow the FLA to do their own thing when all is said and done and maintain control of the areas that they are interested in, then I don't necessarily see it coming to blows in the near term if they are successful. Um, and I imagine that because of what we've seen so far and this level of coordination, that it's going to continue into the foreseeable future.
Matt, I appreciate your kind of your level of expertise and everything going into this. How, I think with the situation in Iran and the Straits of Hormuz is kind of consuming the media aspect, right? And the focus on the geopolitical crisis that we see. But the situation in Mali is significantly degraded in the last couple of months, and we've covered this extensively. And I think this is why I wanted to do it because we continue to see these videos and these footages and this reporting in the Sahel, which points to a very worrying development where we see an Al Qaeda affiliate continue to rise in power and influence, and obviously in the backdrop of another very strong ISIS affiliate, ISIS in the Greater Sahel, overarching in the aspect of Western Africa and the Sahel. So I want to thank you very much for that level of detailed expertise related to the Sahel. John, thank you very much for joining us again to talk about the Middle East and Iran and the problems that's there. And I one of the hopefully in the future episode, John would love to have you back also. The situation in Russia, Ukraine is something that I would want to expand upon and have an episode just dedicated to that, simply because we are continuing to see very interesting developments. We talked about it one of our couple weeks ago, one of our previous episodes, where the Ukrainians were shifting their focus on energy infrastructure in Russia and how they were trying to stop and isolate Crimea. And this week, what we've actually saw was another very interesting tactic that the Ukrainians are doing, which is specifically targeting Russian maritime vessels in the Sea of Azov, right? I mean, it's kind of like we look at what U.S. and Russia and Iran do with the Straits of Hormuz and how Iran targets these oil tankers. Now, what we see is Ukraine doing the same against these Russian vessels to continue to isolate and choke off Crimea, and a very successful and a very expansive campaign utilizing these one-way attack drones. And that is also a very interesting development. I think Russia, Ukraine, and overall requires more analysis because a lot of things continue to develop. But to our listeners, we will continue to monitor the situation. Please make sure you download SITREP to be up to date on all these different crises that are happening around the world. But once again, Matthew, John, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast.